I found the dog at 11:47 at night, which I know because I looked at my phone when he sat down on my foot and refused to move. He was medium-sized, the kind of dog that looks like several breeds had a long conversation and couldn't reach a conclusion. Tan and white, ears that couldn't decide between standing up and folding over, eyes that were deeply serious about everything. He had a collar. The tag said his name was Biscuit, which did not suit him at all, and below that a phone number with a local area code. He looked up at me from my foot like he had been expecting me specifically and was relieved I'd finally shown up. I had been walking home from a late shift. I had not been planning to find a dog. I called the number, and after 4 rings, a woman answered, and she sounded like she had been awake for hours worrying. And when I said I had Biscuit, she made a sound that I can only describe as every muscle in her body releasing at once. She said she'd be there in 10 minutes. She was there in 6, and that was the night everything started. Though I didn't know it yet, I just thought I was returning a dog. Let me go back to the beginning of that week, because nothing about that night makes sense without the context of the person I was before it happened. My name is Daniel. I'm 32 years old. I work as a freelance sound editor, mostly documentary work, occasionally short films, sometimes things I'm not allowed to talk about for reasons that are less glamorous than they sound. And I live on the 3rd floor of a brick building in a neighborhood that smells like coffee in the mornings and something, fried in the evenings, and always, faintly, like rain. I have lived alone for 3 years. Not unhappily. I want to be clear about that. I had built a life that fit me in the way a well-worn jacket fits. Not perfect, not new, but comfortable in all the places that mattered. I had routines I liked. A corner cafe where they knew my order. A park route I walked most evenings. A small collection of very specific habits that would have seemed eccentric to anyone observing from the outside but made complete sense to me. I was, by any reasonable measure, fine. The problem with being fine is that it doesn't prepare you for anything. You're so comfortable in the smallness of it that when something large comes along, you don't have a framework. You just stand there on a wet sidewalk at midnight holding a stranger's dog and thinking, I was not ready for this. I should tell you about the sound work because it matters more than it seems like it would. What I do, in its simplest form, is listen. I listen to things other people don't have time or training to hear. The way a room breathes. The particular silence between 2 people who are not saying something important. The almost inaudible difference between an empty space and an inhabited one. I've been doing it for 8 years and I still find it disorienting sometimes, the way the world opens up when you actually pay attention to it. Most people move through sound the way they move through air. Necessary, taken for granted, unnoticed until it's absent. I notice it constantly. I notice the cafe on my street is quieter on Tuesday mornings than Thursday mornings. I notice that the park has a different acoustic quality in October than in July. Something to do with the leaves and the way the wind moves through them. I notice that some people's silences are empty and some people's silences are full. And the difference is something you feel before you can name it. I tell you this because on the night I found Biscuit, and on the bench at the park, and in the rain, I noticed something about Nora's silences. They were full. The way good rooms are full, not crowded, not loud, just inhabited, present. The kind of silence that makes you want to stay in it. The week before the night I found Biscuit had been ordinary in the way that weeks are when nothing is happening, but everything is quietly building towards something. I had finished a sound mix on a Tuesday, taken a long walk on a Wednesday that had stretched further than I intended because the evening was the kind of cool and clear that makes you want to stay inside it. Thursday, I had coffee with a friend who talked about his new apartment for 40 minutes in a way that made me understand he was actually talking about his new girlfriend, who he wasn't ready to introduce yet. Friday I worked late. Saturday I worked later. Sunday I walked the park route twice without meaning to. And on the second loop, I passed a woman sitting on a bench with a dog in her lap, medium-sized, tan and white, ears undecided. And the dog looked at me as I passed with those serious eyes. And I remember thinking, that's an unusually sober dog. I didn't stop. I didn't think about it again until 2 days later, when I found that same dog sitting on my foot on a street corner at midnight, 3 blocks from the park where I'd seen him. The woman who came to get him arrived in a dark green coat slightly too large for her. Hair pulled back in the way hair gets when someone tied it up quickly without thinking about it. Phone in one hand and keys in the other. She came around the corner at a pace that wasn't quite running but was close enough. And when she saw Biscuit, she stopped completely for just a second. That particular stop people make when something they were afraid had happened didn't happen. And then she crossed to us and crouched down and put her face against the top of his head with her eyes closed. He let her do it without moving, with the gravity of a dog that understood it was important. She stayed like that for a moment. Then she stood and looked at me. "Thank you," she said. "I've been looking for him for 2 hours. I found him about 6 blocks north," I said. He sat on my foot. She looked down at Biscuit, then back at me. "He does that? Is it a habit?" "Only with people he trusts," she said. And there was something in the way she said it, not casual, not performative, just stated as a fact, that I didn't know what to do with. I filed it away. Her name was Nora. She told me on the walk back to where she'd parked, because Biscuit had decided he wanted to walk rather than be carried, and she let him. And I walked with them because I was going the same direction, and also because I found myself not wanting to stop. She had an easy way of talking, not effortless exactly, but unpretentious. She said what she meant. She didn't fill silences with noise. When we reached her car, she thanked me again and loaded Biscuit into the back seat, and he settled immediately into a dog bed that took up most of the seat. And she closed the door and turned to me. "Can I give you something?" she said. "For the trouble." It wasn't trouble. 2 blocks out of your way at midnight is at least a little trouble. "I don't mind walking," I said. And he sat on my foot. I felt responsible. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between assessment and amusement. And then she said, "He only does that with people he trusts." I want you to know that's not nothing. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said goodnight, and she said goodnight. And I walked home thinking about it more than was strictly warranted for a 2-minute conversation with a stranger. I thought about it the next morning, too. And the morning after that. By Thursday, I had mostly talked myself into forgetting about it, the way you talk yourself out of things that seem unlikely to go anywhere. She was a stranger with a lost dog. It was midnight. She'd thanked me and driven away, and I didn't know her last name or where she lived or anything beyond the fact that her dog had sat on my foot because he trusted me, which she had apparently found significant. I had no reason to think I'd see her again. On Friday evening, I was doing the park loop, and I saw them on the bench, not the same bench as before. A different one, closer to the east path, set back slightly from the main walkway. Nora had a book open on her knee, though she wasn't reading it. She was watching Biscuit investigate a patch of grass with the focused concentration of a professional, leash loose in her hand. She looked calm, comfortable, the kind of person who knows how to be still. Biscuit saw me first. His head came up, and those serious eyes found me, and then his whole body did the thing dogs do when they recognize someone. The slight shift of orientation, the tail, the absolute certainty. Nora followed his gaze and saw me. I raised a hand. The universal small wave of a person who has been recognized by someone's dog. She smiled. Closed the book. "He remembered you," she said as I got closer. "I'm flattered." "Don't be too flattered." "He remembered the mail carrier for 3 years and still barked at him every morning." I sat down on the other end of the bench, because she hadn't suggested I shouldn't, and Biscuit had already moved to sit next to my leg with the resolute air of someone who had made a decision. "What's the difference?" I said. "Between the ones he trusts and the ones he doesn't?" She looked at Biscuit thoughtfully. "I've never been able to figure that out exactly. It's not about how people approach him. Some people are very gentle and he's completely indifferent. Some people barely acknowledge him and he decides they're his person." She paused. "I think it might be something to do with how comfortable they are with silence. People who are always filling space make him nervous. I thought about that. I wasn't saying much when he found me." "No," she said. "You weren't." We sat for a while. Biscuit did his investigation work. The park settled into early evening. the light going low and golden through the trees, other people moving past on the path. We talked, but not constantly. There were gaps, and in the gaps neither of us seemed to feel the need to cover them. She asked what I did, and I told her about the sound work, and she asked a question about it that was more specific than most people's questions, which told me she had actually been listening. I asked about her, and she told me she was a landscape architect, which explained the way she looked at the park, not like somewhere to be, but like something someone had built. "Do you come here often?" I said, and then immediately heard how that sounded. She heard it too. The corner of her mouth moved. "Most evenings," she said. "Biscuit has a route. I have a route too." "I know," she said. "I've seen you before." "Before Monday night." I looked at her. "Twice," she said without any particular emphasis. "Once about 3 weeks ago going east, once last Sunday going west, and I would have said something, but Biscuit was being difficult about a squirrel, and by the time I looked up again, you were already past." I thought about my Sunday loops, the way I'd seen a woman on a bench with a dog with serious eyes and kept walking. "I saw you too," I said. "Last Sunday." I remember thinking the dog looked unusually serious. "He is unusually serious." I didn't stop. Neither did I. We looked at each other, and there was something in it. The mutual acknowledgement of 2 missed opportunities and the quiet strangeness of ending up here anyway, that felt like more than coincidence and less than fate. Somewhere in between. The kind of thing you don't have a good word for. I walked with them to the park exit when she said it was Biscuit's dinner time, which he confirmed by standing up with the air of someone who had been patient long enough. She asked if I walked this route regularly, and I said yes most evenings. And she said she and Biscuit were here most evenings too, and the information settled between us without either of us attaching more weight to it than it could hold. It was just information. A fact about our lives that happened to overlap. But I went the next evening. And the one after that, we fell into it the way things fall into place when nobody is forcing them. Gradually, almost without noticing. And then all at once. We started ending up at the same bench at roughly the same time, which was not a coincidence, but which neither of us announced as an intention. We talked about the things people talk about when they're still learning each other. Work, the neighborhood, books we'd read, opinions about things that didn't matter much. She had strong feelings about city planning that I found genuinely interesting. She told me once about a project she'd worked on 3 years ago, a small plaza in a part of the city that had been neglected for decades, and the way she described it. Not the design itself, but the way the space changed how people moved through it, how they paused, how strangers ended up sitting near each other without having decided to, told me more about how she thought than an hour of direct conversation would have. She paid attention to the way things worked on people without them knowing. So did I, in a different medium. I told her that once, and she went quiet in the way she went quiet when something landed. Then she said, "I think that's probably why Biscuit trusted you." I asked what she meant. She said, "People who pay attention to invisible things tend to be safe." I told her once about a sound detail in a documentary I'd worked on that nobody would ever notice. A specific ambient hum I'd layered under a scene, barely audible, that changed the emotional temperature of the whole sequence without the viewer being able to say why. She listened with the full attention of someone who understood that the invisible things were sometimes the most important ones. Then she said, "Can I hear it?" And I sent her a clip that night, and she texted back 40 minutes later. "I felt it before I heard it." That's exactly what you were trying to do, isn't it? It wasn't a question. She already knew. Biscuit spent most of these evenings either investigating the nearby grass or sitting with his shoulder pressed against my leg, which Nora observed without comment, but with what I was coming to recognize as a particular kind of quiet satisfaction. One evening, about 10 days into our accidental routine, she told me something she said she didn't usually tell people quickly. She'd had a long-term relationship end 2 years before, 7 years, an apartment they'd shared, a future that had seemed settled and then wasn't. She said it without drama, the way she said most things, just as information. She said she was fine now, genuinely fine, but that she'd spent the first year after being so careful about everything that she'd almost forgotten how to be impulsive. And the second year? I said, better, she said. I got Biscuit. I looked down at Biscuit, who was watching a pigeon with professional focus. Good decision, I said. He thinks so, she said. He's very confident about his purpose. I told her about my own equivalent. 3 years alone, a life that fit, fine without being remarkable. She listened the way she always listened, completely. Then she said, "Is that enough?" "The fitting?" It was the kind of question that sounds small and isn't. "I thought it was," I said. For a while, she nodded. Didn't push further, but I stayed with the question longer than the conversation did. The evening everything shifted was a Thursday, 2.5 weeks after I'd returned Biscuit at midnight. It had been raining most of the day, the kind of steady October rain that doesn't commit to being a storm but doesn't let up either, and I had assumed the park was off the table. I went anyway, late after the rain had slowed to something light and intermittent. The path was mostly empty, the lights reflecting in the wet stones, the air clean and cold and smelling like earth. She was there. Of course she was there. She had an umbrella she wasn't really using, holding it angled so it mostly shielded Biscuit rather than herself, and she was watching the rain on, the pond with the focused expression she got. When she was thinking about something else entirely, she heard me on the path and turned. "I thought you wouldn't come," she said. "I thought you wouldn't be here. Biscuit's schedule is non-negotiable." Biscuit was sitting by her feet, watching the pond. He didn't get up when I came over, which meant I sat on the wet bench next to him, and he leaned into my leg immediately, and the three of us looked at the pond in the rain for a while. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Probably." That first night, when I brought him back, "You said he only goes to people he trusts." "He does. And you said it like it meant something, beyond just a dog behavior." She was quiet for a moment. "The rain came down light and steady on the water. I've had him for 2 years, she said. He has never in 2 years sat on someone's foot unprompted. He approaches people he likes. He stays near people he trusts. But sitting on a foot is different. It's what he does with me, at home, when he wants me to know he's staying." I looked at Biscuit, who was still looking at the pond. "He was telling me he was staying?" I said. "I think he was telling you that you were his person," she said quietly. "Dogs don't make that decision the way we do. They don't overthink it. They just decide." I thought about that. About the 11:47 at night, the wet sidewalk, the dog who had appeared from nowhere and sat down on my foot like he'd been looking for me. About all the evenings since. About the question she'd asked, is fitting enough? And the fact that I hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. "I've been walking this route for almost 2 years. I said, "I know. And we never actually met. We just kept passing each other." "Yes, until he decided." She turned to look at me. Her hair was damp at the edges from the rain she hadn't bothered to properly shelter from, and her eyes in the low light were the color of something I didn't have a name for. Not quite brown, not quite green, somewhere in between, and entirely their own thing. "Until he decided," she said, "if you have ever been in a moment where everything that has been building quietly, for weeks finally, tips, where the small accumulated, weight of 100 small things reaches a point where continuing to hold it still would take more effort than letting it fall. You know what that bench felt like. It was the kind of moment that doesn't announce itself. It just arrives, and either you're paying attention or you're not. I was paying attention." "Nora," I said. "Yes. I'm going to say something, and you can ignore it if I've read this wrong." She held my gaze. She didn't look away or brace or give me any indication of how this was going to land. She just waited, with the patience of someone who understood that some things took longer than they should. "I don't think I want to keep being someone you pass on a path," I said. She didn't say anything for a moment. The rain came down. Biscuit shifted slightly against my leg without lifting his head. Then she said, "I've been coming to this park at the same time every evening for 10 days. I know. That's not entirely about Biscuit's schedule. I know that too." She looked at me for another long moment, and then something in her face settled. Not a smile exactly, Something quieter than a smile, a kind of resolution. She reached over and tucked her hand into the crook of my arm, not dramatically, not like a declaration, just simply. The way you reach for something you've been meaning to pick up for a while. We sat like that for a long time. The rain went on. The pond reflected the light in small broken pieces. Biscuit fell asleep against my leg with the complete confidence of a dog who had done what he came to do and could rest now. I thought about the moment on the Sunday, 2 weeks before I found him, when I'd walked past a woman on a bench and kept going, about all the loops, all the evenings, all the paths that had run parallel without meeting. There's a version of this where Biscuit doesn't escape on a Monday night, where I don't happen to be walking that particular street at 11:47, where we keep passing each other in the park until one of us moves away and the other never knows what might have been. I am aware of how close to that version I came. But Biscuit sat on my foot. And she told me that wasn't nothing. And she was right. I want to tell you about the days between the rain bench and the dinner, because they were different from the days before, and different matters. Before that Thursday evening, before I said what I said and she tucked her hand into the crook of my arm, and we sat while Biscuit slept. The park. Evenings had been something I looked forward to in the way you look forward to things you haven't quite admitted to yourself yet. I'd find myself leaving work at a consistent time, choosing the route that went past the east entrance, checking the weather not because I minded the rain, but because I wanted to know if they'd be there. These are the small behaviors of a person who is in the process of caring about something and hasn't decided what to do about it yet. After Thursday, I stopped pretending I didn't know what I was doing. On Friday, I brought coffee. Just showed up at the park with 2 cups from the corner place, because I'd been walking past anyway, which was true, and also because I wanted to. She accepted hers with the calm of someone who had been expecting it, which she probably had. She was, I was learning, very good at noticing things before they were said. We walked the full path that evening instead of sitting, and Biscuit set the pace with the authority of someone who had planned the route in advance. And we talked about nothing significant and everything interesting, which is what all the best conversations are. Saturday, she texted me a photo. A small garden corner she'd passed on a job site. She said, volunteer plants growing up through a crack in old concrete. And she'd been thinking about how she could design a space that left room for that kind of thing to happen on its own. I looked at it for a long time. I wrote back, the unplanned parts are usually the best. She replied 3 minutes later. That's what I keep finding out. I didn't know if she meant the garden. I suspected she didn't only mean the garden. Sunday, I went back to the park without planning to. Just ended up there on my afternoon walk. And they were there, and we sat for 2 hours. And at some point, Biscuit fell asleep between us with his chin on my knee. And she looked at that and then looked at me and said, he's going to be insufferable about this, you know. And I said, about what? And she said, being right, and smiled at the pond. The first time we had dinner together was the following Saturday, at a small Italian place near the park that she said was good and that Biscuit had approved of because they kept a water bowl outside. We sat by the window, and the neighborhood moved past outside in that particular Saturday evening way, unhurried, purposeful, lit amber by the restaurant lights. She ordered wine, and I ordered the same thing without asking what it was, which she found funnier than I expected. We talked for 3 hours without noticing the time, which is a thing that happens when you have been building towards something for long enough that the actual arrival of it feels less like a beginning and more like a continuation. Biscuit stayed home that night. She had a neighbor who watched him, she said, an older woman on the second floor who had strong opinions about Biscuit's diet, but otherwise was trustworthy. Does he approve of her? I asked. He tolerates her, she said, which from Biscuit is actually fairly significant. After dinner we walked, because the evening was the kind that asked for it, cold and clear and lit by that particular late October dark that makes city streets look like something you'd want to remember. She told me about a project she was working on, a public garden commission that she was more excited about than she was letting her clients know, because she didn't want to raise expectations before she could meet them. I told her about a documentary I'd just started work on, about a man who had recorded ambient sound in every country in the world and was going deaf. She stopped walking for a second when I said it. "That's the saddest thing I've heard in a month," she said. "Or the most beautiful thing," I said. Depending on how you look at it. She thought about that. Started walking again. "Both," she said. Simultaneously, I walked her to her building. It was different, being there voluntarily, in the light, with time. Not the rushed urgency of midnight and a lost dog, but something slower and more deliberate. We stood on the steps for a minute, neither of us in a hurry. "Biscuit's going to want a report," she said. "What will you tell him?" She tilted her head slightly. "That you showed up." She said it simply, the way she said everything, but I felt the weight of it. That I showed up. Not that I was impressive or interesting or anything particular, just that I was there and present and I'd shown up. Sometimes that's the whole thing. Sometimes that's all anyone is really asking. She went inside, and I walked home, and the city was quiet and lit and smelled like rain that had stopped a few hours ago. I thought about a dog sitting on my foot at midnight and a woman saying that's not nothing with the absolute certainty of someone who had been paying attention. I thought about how long we'd been walking parallel paths and how it had taken an escaped dog on a Monday night to collapse the distance. I thought about the question she'd asked me, "Is fitting enough?" And I thought no. It turns out it isn't. But you don't always know that until something arrives that's better than fitting. Something that feels less like a jacket you've broken in and more like a door you didn't know was there until it opened. She went inside, and I walked home, and the city was quiet and lit and smelled like rain that had stopped a few hours ago. I thought about a dog sitting on my foot at midnight and a woman saying that's not nothing with the absolute certainty of someone who had been paying attention. I thought about how long we'd been walking parallel paths and how it had taken an escaped dog on a Monday night to collapse the distance. I thought about the question she'd asked me, "Is fitting enough?" And I thought no. It turns out it isn't. But you don't always know that until something arrives that's better than fitting. Something that feels less like a jacket you've broken in and more like a door you didn't know was there until it opened. I should tell you what happened the following week, because it was different from the weeks before, and I want you to understand what different felt like. On Monday, she texted me a voice memo. Not words, just sound. 30 seconds of the Garden Commission site at dusk, she said, because she'd been thinking about ambient texture and wanted a sound person's opinion. I put earbuds in and listened. Wind through something metallic, faint traffic in the distance, a bird somewhere high and unhurried, and underneath all of it, a low, steady hum that I realized after a moment was water moving through a pipe somewhere underground. Invisible infrastructure. The sound of a city sustaining itself without anyone noticing. I listened to it 3 times before I texted back. The pipe. That's the whole design. Build everything else around that. She replied 20 minutes later. I was thinking the same thing, but I needed someone else to hear it first. On Wednesday, I met them at the park, and she had brought a thermos of tea, which she poured into 2 mismatched cups that she'd carried in her coat pockets, and we sat until it got genuinely cold and the park emptied out around us. And she told me about the city she'd grown up in, smaller, quieter, a different kind of grid. And I told her about the first documentary I'd worked on, a film about a lighthouse keeper that had taken 2 years and changed how I thought about solitude. She asked what it had changed. I said I'd gone in thinking solitude was about absence and come out understanding it was about presence, what you're present with when other people aren't around. She was quiet for a moment after I said that. Then she said, "Biscuit taught me that." And I looked at the dog, who was watching the dark pond with his usual professional gravity, and I thought, I believe you. On Friday it rained and they weren't at the park, and I walked the loop alone and found it genuinely different without them there. Not bad, just different. The way a room is different when someone you've started expecting has stepped out. I noticed the park's sounds without the overlay of conversation, and I thought about what she'd said about Biscuit only sitting on feet he trusted. And I thought about how trust works, the way it happens before you've decided to let it, the way Biscuit had simply known, simply acted, without waiting to be certain. I texted her that evening, Rained you out tonight." She replied an hour later. Biscuit was deeply offended. He blames the weather personally. Then, "Were you there?" I said yes. She said, "I know." He could tell. He kept looking toward the east path. I put my phone down and sat with that for a long time. The second time I met Biscuit after that night, he sat on my foot again. We were in Nora's apartment, and I had come over for the first time on a Sunday afternoon, and he had greeted me at the door with the same serious expression he gave everything. And then he had walked with me to the living room and sat down squarely on my left foot and looked up at Nora as if to say, "I told you." She looked at me over the top of his head with an expression that was warm and quietly amused, and something else I was beginning to learn the name for. "He's never done that inside before," she said. "This is his home territory. What does it mean?" I said. She thought about it for a moment, looked down at Biscuit, who had made himself comfortable with the resolution of a dog who had finished a very long project. "I think it means he's decided," she said. Biscuit didn't move. I didn't move either. The afternoon light came through the apartment windows and fell across the floor in long, pale rectangles, and somewhere outside the city made its Sunday sounds. And everything was very quiet and very full at the same time. Some decisions take years. Some take 11:47 on a Monday night and a dog who knows something you don't. I've stopped trying to figure out which kind is better. I just know that when Biscuit sat on my foot on that wet corner in October, something in me already understood, even before I'd met her. Even before the park bench and the rain and the dinner and the Sunday afternoon with the light on the floor, something already knew. The way he knew, without overthinking it, without waiting for a better moment. Just a decision, made quietly, in the dark. It turns out that's sometimes all it takes.